We are in week 4 of our Advent journey, and of course this lands right next onto next Saturday, which if, again, you're new to church or new to settings like this, next Saturday is Christmas Eve. I know you've already heard ad nauseum announcements about it, but just in case you weren't listening the last 10 minutes, we are hosting 2 gatherings, one at 5 p.m., one at 8 p.m. next Saturday, and I tell you that because we really believe these 2 gatherings are going to be powerful and palpable for you and for your family and for your friends. So we hope and pray that you're making plans to attend. But as I mentioned, we're in week 4 of this Advent experience, and Christians all over America today, even nominal Christians, are parroting this phrase: peace on earth, goodwill towards men on whom his favor rests. And so the question hanging over our space today is, where is the peace? Where is the peace? Meaning, we're all looking around and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of peace. It actually just feels like there's a lot of unnecessary frenetic energy. There's kind of chaos reigning in our life. And so it's a really appropriate question to go, where is the peace? I was with an elderly gentleman 6 weeks ago who discovered that his bone cancer had returned. And so I had the opportunity to sit down and just have a really sober conversation about the peace that was available in that moment. The peace that is available in eternity. And so every one of us, I think, we're coming into this season with eyes wide open, feeling the weight of that. I mean, we know that at least it feels like we're in this perpetual economic downturn, or there are countries all over the world that want to blow us off the map, or the WHO, the World Health Organization, just this week or 2 weeks ago, reported that in America we have the highest rate of suicide we've ever had this last year. 48,000 people committed suicide. That's 131 people every day that took their own life. So there may not be a more relevant question today than where is the peace? And so if you're in the space today, or maybe you're watching online today, I think all of us have at least enough self-awareness to know, do I have peace? And some of you are thinking today, I don't have peace. In fact, I've never really had peace. And what I'm holding on to for you or for someone that you care about is that before Christmas, you can say with confidence, peace is on the earth. Because peace reigns in me. And what we would say is that peace is not some sort of nebulous idea. Peace is a person. His name is Jesus. In fact, Isaiah, 700 years before Jesus ever walked on the earth, he prophesied about this person that would come, and he would be called the Prince of Peace. In fact, listen to how he described this person coming. Isaiah chapter 9, he says, "For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." In fact, in the Hebrew language, the word for peace is the word shalom. And it means peace, but it also means this idea of flourishing. In fact, it's a cornerstone idea in the Hebrew culture. In fact, even today in Israel, which ironically is primarily secular, meaning they don't really have anything to do with God, a very small percentage. The people of Israel, they long for, even pray for shalom for the nation state. And the reason is they're right in the middle of all these other countries that do not want them to exist. And so they are longing for shalom. They're longing for a kind of peace over their land, over their lives, longing for a flourishing over their lives, over their future. But when Isaiah prophesied about this Prince of Peace coming, he was not thinking about this person that was going to come and broker a ceasefire. He dreamt of this man that was going to come, and he was going to bring a peace that passes all understanding. He was going to bring a flourishing in the middle of chaos that we couldn't understand, but we knew was true. We could feel it. We could see it. And if you're familiar with the Christmas story, you're probably familiar with the story of the angels coming to the shepherds, and they're making this announcement. And the announcement's glory to God in the highest, peace among men. And here's the irony of that story. They come into a time in history that was the most chaotic. It was the least peaceful night on planet Earth when they make this announcement of peace. But I mean, isn't that how peace works? Peace is most powerful. Peace is most palpable with the backdrop of chaos, in the backdrop of pain. In fact, in Luke 2, Mary and Joseph, I mean, they had to be feeling this. They were feeling the weight of, where is the peace? Because Mary and Joseph, their life's been turned upside down, interestingly, by God. Right? I mean, they had their life planned. They had a dream. And so God breaks in, and he comes to little teenage Mary, and he's like, I know you've got a dream. I know you got some plans. You're going to get married. There's your boyfriend, Joseph, but I'm about to blow that up. And you're going to have a baby, and Joseph's not going to be the daddy, and I want you to name the baby Jesus. I want you to name him Emmanuel, God with us, because God's about to draw near. And then what's amazing is that as they step into that story and they live into that story, they come into Jerusalem and they come to the temple to dedicate baby Jesus. And this guy they never knew, this old man, appears to be a creeper, but it turns out he's not. He walks up to baby Jesus, grabs baby Jesus out of Mary's arms and lifts him up like Simba, and he prays this prayer. He says, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant. He's talking about himself. You may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. So in the midst of chaos, he's like, I've got peace now. In the midst of panic, he's like, my gaze is falling on the Prince of Peace. And he's like, now I'm dismissed in peace. I would say it another way. One of the reasons he has peace is because he now has a little bit of perspective. He's been longing, waiting for, looking to the redemptive plan of God, looking back in history, seeing all the fingerprints of God, seeing how God has moved, seeing the way God has promised to come and step in as Emmanuel. And in this moment, this man sees Emmanuel. He sees the Prince of Peace. And all of a sudden, he's like, the exclamation point has been put on the story. And the reason that matters is you and I are stepping and longing and praying for peace. One of the ways that we step into that supernatural peace of heaven, the peace that passes all understanding, the way that happens is you and I need a little bit of perspective. You and I have got to zoom out. We've got to see the redemptive plan of God. Take the magnifying glass, look for the fingerprints of God all throughout history and begin to see them in our own life. And when that happens, like this guy, we're going to be people of peace. Chaos around us may not be stilled, but you and I will walk in peace. So what we do every fourth week in Advent is we take a week and we sort of look back in a different part of history, and we are investigative reporters, and we look back with a magnifying glass, with a sort of a policeman mentality, and we look for the fingerprints of God in redemptive history, and then we land once again every year on the answer. Whose fingerprints are these? And we're able to say with a confidence and with a kind of supernatural peace, these fingerprints are from the Prince of Peace. So I want to zoom out as we begin this storyline back to Genesis. So if you got a copy of the scriptures, you can start there with me. Because what's happening in Genesis, which is the beginning of the story, Adam and Eve have sinned against God. They have rebelled against God. They have broken fellowship with God. They have broken union with one another. And because of that, there's now this tsunami of sin and chaos that washes over all creation. And in that moment, God, the Creator, steps into the storyline, and he's like, I've already got a solution. I had a solution before the problem arose, but the solution is not laws. The solution is not a bunch of rules for you to follow. The solution for redemption is I've got a son. The solution is there is a person. There's going to be a baby that is going to be born. In fact, he says this in Genesis 3. There's not a scripture. I just want to make reference to it. But it's in 3:15. And God says there is going to be a seed of the woman. The seed of the woman is going to put his heel on the head of the serpent or the head of Satan. Now, I first read this when I first became a Christian, and I was like, what's the seed of the woman? Because I was old enough to know, like, women don't have seed. right? And if that doesn't make sense, you just ask your mom or an appropriate website, right? You'll figure it out. But what I later discovered is that the seed of the woman, he's talking about a man. A man is going to come from the woman, and that man is going to put his heel on the head of the serpent, on the head of Satan. And in that moment, Adam, he's hearing this. Because God appears in that moment. Adam's hearing this promise of redemption, and he looks at his wife, who, by the way, doesn't even have a name yet. And so Adam, the name giver, he gives the name to his wife. And he says, I'm going to call you Eve, which means life. Because I know life is coming from you. Redemption is going to flow from you. And so then Eve, she has a baby 9 months later, and she names him, I've got one. That's what Cain means. And so she's like, is he the one? And God's like, no, he's not the one. If you know the story, he's definitely not the one. And Eve's like, well, I got more chances. I'm pretty young. I was just made, a couple years ago. And so I'm going to have another baby. She names him Abel, which means vanity. So she knew pretty early on he is not going to be the one. And then history rolls on, and we keep looking for the fingerprints of God. And so Noah's dad, he names his son, this is spoiler, names him Noah, right? And Noah means rest. And Noah's dad's like, maybe because I'm holding on to this promise that redemption is going to come, I'm going to name him Rest, because maybe he's going to be the one that's going to bring rest to our restless hearts. But he definitely was not the one. And so history rolls on. And so you got Genesis 1 and 2, which is creation. You got Genesis 3 is the fall. Genesis 4 and 5, you see how jacked up people can be, how frail, how fractured, how poisoned we will be for now and into the future. And then to Genesis 12, God zooms back in. He zooms back into one person, to a guy named Abram. And this is what it says in Genesis 12. It says, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God comes to Abram, later to be Abraham, and he's like, look, I know you've been in Babylon, you've been an ignorant sun worshiper, but I'm going to pluck you out of that, and I'm going to call you, and if you'll just believe who I say I am, if you'll just trust that I'm going to do what I'm going to say I'm going to do, then things are going to go well for you. In fact, your storyline and my purposes in your storyline are going to be a blessing to all the nations on the earth. And he's like, so here's what I want you to do, Abraham. I want you to move from Babylon, a power source, and I want you to move to this forgotten little strip of land that nobody's ever heard of, and I want you to build a life there, and I want you to spend all of your days just trusting me, believing me. It will go decades before you see a promise fulfilled, but I am a promise keeper, and so move. And so he and his wife, Sarah, they moved to this little strip of land. They live their life in obscurity, but blessing. They live their life in shalom, and then they have a baby named Isaac. And then Isaac grows up under the shalom of God as he trusts God. And Isaac has a baby, and that baby grows up into a guy named Jacob. And Jacob, in spite of how fractured and broken he was, he has this amazing, powerful experience with God. And God changes his name, which is what he's prone to do over our lives. And he gives him the name Israel. And Israel grows up, and he has 12 sons. And 11 of those sons, if you know the story, 11 of the sons hates one of the other sons, which apparently happens from time to time. And those 11 sons hated him so much that they sold that one son into slavery, into Egypt. They didn't really know where he was going, but he went into slavery into Egypt. And then history rolled on, and then a famine overtook the entire land. And those 11 sons, they went to Egypt looking for solace, looking for salvation, looking for food, looking for safety. And they come into Egypt desperate. Unbeknownst to them, Joseph, their brother sold into slavery, is now at the height of power in Egypt. And they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them, and he sees them, and he forgives them, and he saves them. In fact, Genesis 50:20, if you're memorizing scripture, this is such a beautiful verse. He says, this is Joseph speaking. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, for the saving of many lives. Meaning, I've seen the fingerprints of God. I know where redemption comes. And so as he brings his family together into Egypt, now living under the shalom, living under the peace of God, they thrive. These 12 sons and these 12 families, now they thrive and they turn into the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Jacob, and they thrive and they grow exponentially, and Egypt is watching and they are getting nervous. And so instead of celebrating their growth, they enslave the people of Israel for 400 years. And then God zooms in again. And he zooms in on a guy named Moses. Anybody hear Moses? Let my people go. Some of you are like Charlton Heston. Others of you are like Prince of Egypt. Okay, we had lots of generations here. And God uses Moses in spite of how jacked up, how frail he was. And he uses him to rescue the nation of Israel, 1 million strong. And he brings them back to that little strip of land that nobody had ever heard of, nobody really cared about. And he brings them back to that little strip of land. And God comes to them and he says, listen, if you'll just trust me, if you'll just believe who I say I am, if you'll believe I'll do what I say I'm going to. I mean, hello, were you there during the Red Sea thing? Like, hello, you should know I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. So just trust me. If you'll believe me, if you'll follow me, I'm going to cause a flourishing. I'm going to cause a peace, a shalom over the land, over your lives, and you guys are going to be the PR agents over the entire world. Meaning other nations on the other side of the world are going to say, who is their God? But Israel, just like us, or us just like Israel, dumpster fires through and through. And so they're like, yeah, I mean, thanks for the whole Israel or the whole Egypt thing, but we got it from here. We're going to take control now. And so they didn't really want God to rule, so they rose up an earthly king, a guy named David. And admittedly, David was awesome in his own right. He was called a man after God's own heart, but still a dumpster fire. He was considered a man of blood, killed so many people in the name of taking over the land. And yet God loved him, and he loved God. And then his son, Solomon, who admittedly considered the wisest person in the world to govern. He was not the wisest person. That's a misnomer. And the reason I know that is all you have to do is look at his life. He was not the wisest person. He was the wisest to govern. And he was wicked in so many ways. He caused the nation of Israel to chase after idols. He caused them to chase after a wicked kind of sensuality that ultimately caused the entire nation of Israel, the nation state, to split down. Not the middle. It split to northern and southern kingdoms. And the northern kingdom had 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, where Jerusalem was, had 2 tribes. And God comes to the northern tribe first, and he's like, listen, I'm for you. I'm your God. You can trust me. I will do what I say I'm going to do. I am who I say I am. If you'll trust me, things will go well for you. Your land will prosper. A shalom will come over your life and over your future. But Israel, being the more wicked of the 2 kingdoms, they basically gave God the finger. And God's like, well, if you continue in rebellion, I'm going to kick you out of the land. And they continued in rebellion, and in 721 BC, he brings in the Assyrians, which were the powerhouse of the time, and he brings them in, and they basically kidnap the entire northern kingdom and bring them into exile, never to be heard from again. They're gone. And then he comes to the southern kingdom, and he's like, did you just see what I did? If you'll trust me, if you'll follow me, if you'll believe that I am who I say that I am, I'm good towards you. I want to bring flourishing and a peace over your land, but it only comes as you trust in me, the Prince of Peace. If you'll do that, life will go so well for you. And Judah, the southern kingdom, not being quite as wicked, but still giving God the finger, going, we're going to do it our own way. And in 586, he does the same thing. He kicks them out of the land, bringing the Babylonians in, dragging them into exile for 70 years. But unlike the northern kingdom, their hearts turned. Exile pain caused them to cry out to God and go, God, you are worthwhile. God, you are the satisfier. God, you are the source over all things. And so God relents, God shows mercy, brings them out of exile from Babylon after 70 years, and guess where he brings them? Back to this little tiny strip of land that nobody ever cared about. And by that time, it's the end of the Old Testament. You got Nehemiah, you got Ezra, the rebuilding the temple. And by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament, if you've ever read it, you're like, this God is crazy. Like, why is he so passionate about these rebellious people? Why didn't he just kill all of them? Just start over. They're the worst. And yet this God is so passionate about them. God is so passionate about his love towards them and building shalom on the earth through them. And then history rolls on. And in 300 BC, you've got this guy that rises up that you've probably never heard of, a guy named Philip of Macedonia, kind of a big deal in the time. And he's got a son named Alexander that you and I would know as Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was being mentored by Aristotle. And Aristotle was mentoring him in military philosophy and philosophy of life. It turns out Alexander the Great was incredible. He was great. He was so smart, so strategic. And the reason I know that is because from age 20 to 32, he conquers the entire world. And so at 32, he's like, I'm the king of the world. And then he promptly dies at 32, okay? But not before he does something so incredible, so great. He unifies the entire world with one language. It's called Hellenization, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. He unifies the world, and now everybody speaks Greek. Everybody, okay? And then a few years later, around 63 BC, a new power rises. And if you remember world history, you remember this, the world power was Rome, and they conquer even more of the world than Alexander the Great, from England to India, and they ruled it for 1,400 years. And so in 63 AD, they conquer. They rule everything. And about 30 years later, they consolidate all the power of Rome into a single person. They call that person the Caesar. And Caesar, the beautiful strategy of Caesar is he institutes or he accomplishes what they later call Pax Romana, which is Roman peace. And they accomplish a peace, but it's not the peace we're talking about. They accomplish a peace that is a lack of conflict. There really was no more wars. There were no more regional conflicts. They ruled the world with an iron fist, but there wasn't any conflict. And it was beautiful in some real way. And at the very same time, Rome, not only did they institute Pax Romana, this Roman peace, but they also began to build roads everywhere they went. Because every city, every country they would conquer, they would tear it down like the Marines, and then they would build it back up, right? They would build roads. And if you've heard this old statement, all roads lead to Rome, anybody ever hear that? That's a true statement. All the roads from the countries they conquered would lead right back to the centerpiece of the empire. In fact, when Amy and I were in Italy a few years ago, we were on one of those roads called the Appian Way. I mean, like 18-wheelers are barreling down the Appian Way even today, 2,000 years later. So this beautiful thing that Rome does. Because here's where we land in redemptive history. So now we have roads in the world, and there's peace. And now, which means you can travel, and now everybody speaks the same language. And in this really far away, forgotten little piece of property where the people of God live, God steps into time, and he does something that is so counterintuitive to redemption. He comes to this little teenage girl, this nobody, and he says, Mary, I'm going to do something through you. I'm going to do something in you that's going to change the world. In fact, you're going to have a baby born of the Holy Spirit, and he is going to be a peace bringer into the middle of chaos, and it's going to change everything. In fact, here's what Paul the Apostle says in the New Testament. Galatians chapter 4. He says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So is there a logic to God's timing? Yeah, there's a logic to God's timing. He says, in the fullness of time. When it was just at the right moment, when there were roads and there were peace and everybody spoke the same language, God steps in where it would make the most sense. and redemption takes hold. Paul says it this way in Romans chapter 5. While we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. So in the fullness of time and at just the right time, God becomes a man and he steps into history and he puts an exclamation point on the story that he has been writing since the beginning. And he does it so that we'll see it. He does it so that we'll respond to it. Let me illustrate it this way, and this is a weird illustration, especially since we're in the middle of winter, but whenever you go to the beach, and you're on the beach, and you're hanging out with your kids or with family or whatever, and you're like, okay, I just need a break. I'm going to go out in the water, and you take your big floaty or your big inner tube, anybody like that. You go out in the water, and you're like, I'm just going to go get some rays. Leave me alone. And so you're out there for like 30 minutes, and you're loving it, and then you sort of wake up from your nap, and you look over at the beach, and you are disoriented, and you are panicking because you look, and all of your stuff has been stolen, and your kids have been kidnapped. And then you stand up straight in the water, and you're looking, and you realize, okay, your stuff is not missing. You've just moved, right? The current of the ocean has moved your raft a quarter mile down the strip. And as you're looking more carefully, you look like a quarter mile down the beach, and there are your kids waving at you, or your husband or your roommate. They're like waving at you, and all of a sudden the disoriented feeling, the panic that you had is now quickly replaced by peace. And it's the peace of familiarity. It's the peace of someone sees you. It's the peace of now you see it. And I was thinking about that this week because that is the story of Advent. That is the perfect story of Advent because God goes to great lengths from the beginning of history, from the beginning of our timeline to get our attention, and our role is to give him our attention. It's to give him our deepest affection, and like Israel, to say, I will trust you and I will follow you. You are who you say you are. And I long for flourishing. I long for the shalom that you're bringing into the world.